The way we lead impacts the way people live. This world needs truly human leadership.
Politics has a lot of influence, and media has a lot of influence, and culture has a lot of influence on how we view the world around us, including how we lead others. And so, to me, this book helps to push back against these more power-based ways of leading people that are dehumanizing people rather than lifting them up.
I'm Brent Stewart, your host. Thanks for listening. This podcast is an outreach of Barry-Wehmiller. You can find us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, Threads, and Blue Sky at Barry-Wehmiller, and find our podcast articles and videos at trulyhumanleadership.com. Marcel Schwantes is a speaker, author, executive coach, and an Inc. magazine contributing editor. Marcel writes and delivers presentations, workshops, courses, and coaching programs about the human side of business and how cultures of care, connection, and belonging power companies to thrive and outperform the competition. Marcel also hosts a popular Love in Action podcast on which our CEO Bob Chapman has been a guest. Now, Marcel has a new book that just came out, Humane Leadership, Lead with Radical Love, Be a Kick-Ass Boss. And there are a lot of parallels in Marcel's writing with what we talk about on this podcast. In his book, Marcel draws on personal experiences, case studies, and compelling research to reveal how leaders can transform organizations by embracing genuine care for their people, something we talk about a lot here. And you can find out more about Marcel and his book at marcelschwantes.com. That's marcelschwantes.com. We first met Marcel a number of years ago through his work for Inc., where he included Barry-Wehmiller in some of his articles, but there was one titled, Here's a Top 10 List of the World's Best CEOs, but they lead in a totally unique way, where our CEO Bob Chapman was ranked number 3. Now, we're going to talk about a lot of things on this podcast today, but we're going to start things off with asking Marcel about that article and why Bob was included.
I was delving into the world of servant leadership, and everywhere I looked, Bob's name kept coming up. And so as I kept doing the research on servant leadership to inform my own work, all of the names on that list in the Inc. article that you referred to also popped up with Bob. And so, Cheryl Batchelder, Bob, and I forget, that list is going on 10 years, I think now. Yeah. That's sort of how I was informed on who to put in that article, because I wanted to make sure that they were obviously profitable companies, right? Successful, and that they actually led through a more of a bottom-up approach. And that's about the time I ran into Everybody Matters and found out about Barry-Wehmiller as an organization. And I thought, for sure, Bob has got to be on the list. And so that's sort of the short version of how he ended up there.
Whatever you want to call it, conscious business, truly human leadership, servant leadership, It's a constant topic. And you know this with your podcast and the interviews that you do. It's a not necessarily an evergreen topic, but it's something that keeps coming around as we see different things going on in the world and we see the workforce impacted in different ways. So people are looking for this stuff and interested in this stuff because they're constantly looking for a better way. And you obviously were looking for something better, something different in terms of business and leadership than what had been out there previously. Tell me about your journey. How did you get interested in this? How did you get started on it? In terms of your writing, your podcasting, all the stuff that you've been doing.
So I flash back to 2002 as I was coming out of an organization that I would say was led by toxic management. And I talk about that in as well in chapter 1. I ended up in another organization, another hospital. So I went from a very toxic hospital where I had health issues, ended up in ER, and had a 2-month disability due to toxic management. So I left there, went to another hospital, and under a completely different environment. And that's where the whole servant leadership thing kicked in, because the person that I reported to was all about humane leadership. He was all about caring and building trust with his employees. And I didn't really have a reference point at that time because, the 2-3 years prior to that, I was looking over my shoulder every day going, okay, where's the hammer coming down from today, right? And so it's the stress-induced environment that led to my health issues. So I didn't have a reference of good leadership, or if you want, servant leadership or humane leadership. And so I ran into Bruce, and Bruce was that boss. And so I started my own investigation of what makes Bruce such an effective boss. And so we're in the mid 2000s now. And so I started my journey of trying to understand what would cause a person like Bruce to want to spend so much time investing in our development and removing obstacles from our path so that we could succeed and flourish on the job. And, all that makes business sense as well, right? Because when you feel good about the work that you do, you feel good about yourself, you're going to perform at a higher level. And so there's some intrinsic value there. And so, I was a perfect case study, right? Initially. And then as I moved on and became a coach and started to coach leaders, I wanted to bring this philosophy of, well, how do we maximize people's performance? Well, you do it by caring about it. And Bob is a perfect classic example of that, right? He talks about how every employee is somebody's daughter or son, right? And each person relies on the leader for guidance, to be cared for, et cetera. But I took it one step further. And I remember the conversation I had with Bob on the first time I brought him to the podcast. I think he was guest number 3. We were kind of bantering back and forth with the buzz terms, right? And he wouldn't go as far as calling it love. And I thought that was really interesting. He's definitely comfortable with caring, the caring part, right?
Yeah.
And so I just took it a step further, that people want to feel cared for, yes, but I call it for what it really is. And that's sort of the crux of the book, is that people want to feel loved. And here we are.
So what was the moment you decided that you needed to do more research and you needed to spread the word about that there's a better way to lead and start your career in writing and podcasting? And
yeah, so let's start with the podcast, because the podcast really led to the book. So short version on the podcast, guest number 4, I think he followed Bob, or maybe he came before Bob, was Ken Blanchard. And so Blanchard and I are bantering about servant leadership, and he says, yeah, Marcel, servant leadership is love in action. And, the light bulb in my head goes off. And because the podcast was not named Love in Action when I started. In fact, it was something else when I interviewed Bob. So after I heard Ken say servant leadership is love in action, I thought that's a perfect moniker for a podcast. Although a lot of people are going to stumble into religious concepts, and maybe there's another podcast out there that under the same title that is a faith-based, right? But I ran with it because I wanted to be edgy, and so I started the exploration of how do we infuse more love into leadership, into the workplace, right? And so that was the infancy of the whole love as a business strategy or a leadership strategy idea back then, right? With the podcast and bringing in people that sort of aligned with the principles. But then I had a problem. Like now I have to kind of educate people. What do I mean by love? Right? It's a very squishy, counterintuitive term. It's still, I wouldn't say it's widely accepted in the business lexicon. You don't throw the word love around loosely in business terms, right? Yeah, let's go love each other, but as I kind of looked under the hood and investigated all of the literature and talked to world leaders, et cetera, some of them didn't have a problem with expressing the word love in a business setting. In fact, more and more people are coming out to say, yeah, well, heck, if you're going to lead effectively, love is part of the equation. So then to dispel the idea that love is something fuzzy and has negative like connotations that are going to make HR people nervous, love has to be backed by action. So it's no longer love as a feeling or an emotion or something that you romanticize, right? And so we consult the Greeks because they have really a good understanding of what love is. They define it 8 different ways. And so as I dug into what the Greeks are talking about, if you remember from your high school or college days, right, you got eros and you got all these different types of definitions of love, but the one that really sticks is agape. And agape is love that's backed by action, and it's consistent with all of the research coming out on compassion, compassionate management, and empathy, and all of the science that's coming out on positive psychology and things like that, right? And that agape love is the one that really tends to lead to results. And if you want to even go a step further, if you apply that kind of love, it is kind of radical, but it does work. And so that's how I arrived at the book, because I talk about, lead with radical love, be a kick-ass boss. But that's under the title Humane Leadership, because if you're going to be a humane leader, you're going to have to love well. Love in the agape sense, right? And backed by action, making sure that people are set up for success. And there's a lot of love behind that. And we can talk more about the framework of what I found.
If you're doing coaching or talking to anybody and talking to leaders, and you use these terms, love in action or agape, and they recoil back from you, how do you win them over, or even just help them be more comfortable with that term? Because it is kind of it elicits a little bit more of a response, I think.
Yeah, I start to cite literature. I start to bring data. If you're a person that thinks more left brain, and I bring left brain stuff into the conversation, right? So then I might bring in the Gallup organization's data on employee engagement, right? And how there is some love aspects in their 212 survey about recognition and make sure that people have what they need, and is there a best friend at work? All these concepts that, if you're familiar with Gallup's research, lends to having a leadership structure that cares about people, that sets them up for success. And so then I bring that conversation over to, okay, tell me about, how's your engagement? What are your metrics right now? Are you meeting the standards for humanizing the workplace to make sure people are succeeding and growing and developing? And that's when people start to shrink back, because they realize, well, yeah, we're having some problems with, attrition in ABC department. Okay, well, what's going on there? Yeah, people just our surveys indicate that their managers are hearing them. Oh, really? So that's a listening. It sounds to me like you're talking about lack of listening, maybe a lack of gathering feedback. Oh yeah, that's it, Marcel. That's probably it. We could probably be better at listening more to our employees. Oh, really? Okay. Well, hey, so think about it. If you're becoming a better listener, does that mean you're caring about somebody, right? You're more extending more care because you're interested in what they have to say. You're curious about their perspective, right? You're a better listener. Yeah, that's true. Okay, well, in that sense, you're kind of extending a little more love their way, right? Yeah, Marcel, I see where you're going now. All right. Okay. I got you. Okay. So that's kind of how I try to level the playing field. If the term is too fuzzy, all right, let's look at another angle. Okay. The business angle. Let's find out about how your workforce is feeling about their managers, about the work environment. And usually, I'm not saying 100%, but usually you can track the data back to the fact that people are not being heard, not being cared for, not being set up for success. They're not getting what they need. Their voice isn't being heard. So things of that nature. So it's all pointing to a lack of love. Again, my interpretation, right? And so I filled the void there with, all right, well, let's bring more love into the workplace.
Your book was a long time coming in that you basically were doing research for a long time with the work that you do, with your interviews, the writing that you do. You were learning for a long, long time. Tell me about that process of getting to where you knew you were ready to do the book and you had something that you really knew that you wanted to say.
Yeah, so that's an interesting turn of events, because as I was learning myself and applying what I was learning to coaching sessions with clients, I started to investigate the sort of the origins of some of the concepts of love from religious literature. And because my orientation is as a person of faith is I look at the writings of Jesus, right? Jesus of Nazareth in the New Testament. And there is one piece of literature there, if you dig into the Corinthians account, First Corinthians, there was a disciple of Jesus. His name was Paul of Tarsus, and he is talking about how the Corinthian church at that time in the first century lacked love, and so he starts to really taking them to task and basically just call them on their lack of love. And so he starts to define what love is in a communal sort of like a context of relating to one another in a healthy community, spiritual community at that point. So I took those, I dissected the verses, and so I was able to boil it down to 5. And then I'm okay, I got these 5, and well, let's back it up against what science and leadership literature has to say. Does it hold up? Well, sure enough, it does, because a lot of it is already all over leadership literature, right? But the first one is sort of counterintuitive to this day, and that's patience. That's the first thing he says. Love is patient. So here are the 5: patience, kindness, and the third one, again, it's been written over and over again. It's humility. The fourth one is advocacy, right? Leadership advocates for others. And then the fifth one also is sort of the crux of, if you have really good leadership and good leadership culture, you're going to have a place of trustworthiness. People trust their leader, but the leader also extends that trust out to others. So patience, I think it's really an important one in this day and age where people are just going 100 miles an hour, not listening very well. And so what I found is that I identified 3 business applications for individual, team, and organizational performance, if you will. And you have to have, number one, you have to use patience to slow down, because when you do, it improves your decision making. Too often we run through all the stop signs of checks and balances because we are, well, I hate to say it, a lot of leaders are impulsive in their decision making, right? So they just want to go 0 to 100 to get to the short-term results. And so that's the first one is slow down to improve decision making, because you might have better solutions if you think things through. And the other thing I found is that when you apply patience as a leader and you build that as a organizational strength, where you set the example, it really helps with the mental health aspect. people are less anxious and they're less stressed, and they're, it's just kind of, it calms down the sort of the organization to be able to think better because their minds aren't racing so fast, right? So it improves organizational health and well-being. And then the third thing I found about patience is the active listening part. We mentioned this before, right? You leverage active listening as a patient strategy to help with relationships, to help with decision making, and things of that nature. Leadership is kind, right? So that speaks to the kindness part. And in the original Corinthians account, when I looked at the Greek root word for kindness, it means to be useful, serving, and gracious. And so when I look at those words, I look at it as having, each one of those has intent, right, behind it. It involves taking actions that show you care about others. Barry-Wehmiller is full of examples that Bob documented in his book about how is it that you care about others. And the cool thing about kindness is that if you demonstrate kindness to your peer, your coworker, if you're a leader, to your subordinate, and you model the way forward, people are much more willing then to model that. And so kindness spreads throughout the organization. So what that does, it lends to a work atmosphere that becomes more civil, more respectful, and less fear-based. So it's completely the opposite of that first hospital that I worked for, which is totally absent of kindness, right? And because it led by the iron fist is a fear-based, intimidating environment, and that's just the way they were, right? And so that was the cultural expectation. That's how we do things around here, right? But in a leadership of kindness, you'll find that employees not only provide better customer service, they usually do it even without prompting. I mean, this is a no-brainer, Brent. I mean, in kind cultures, you develop better relationships at work. So what happens when you have really good relationships at work? Collaboration is off the charts. People are free to express their ideas and contribute at a higher level. So that's the kindness part of it. The third of the 5 is leadership is humble. So that speaks to humility. We have so many examples, right? So the ones that I want to boil it down to, if you're going to bring humane leadership and lead with love, well, how does that relate to humility, right? You basically give people permission to ask for help. But not only that, but you make it an expectation for people to offer help. So when you have that combination of, I'm free and safe to ask for help. I'm not going to be reprimanded. Nobody's going to look down on me. You're supposed to know what you're doing, right? That's why we hired you. No, it's you ask for help, and then other people are willing to give help as well. And so that creates, again, an atmosphere of give and take, and you create more ownership. And more collaboration. If you're willing to offer help and ask for help, you're collaborating better. You're getting to solutions quicker than, say, if you skate around issues because you're afraid of extending a hand or asking for help, because how am I going to be perceived, et cetera. Well, in cultures like that, where it's fear-based and you don't feel safe, you're not getting to the root of issues or solving problems as fast as those that do ask for help and offer help. And then in humility, you're willing to admit mistakes, because when you make mistakes, it is a learning opportunity. There's the value of, hey, I messed up, and you model the way as a boss to say, don't worry, I'm human, I mess up here too, but let's figure out how to get around this together. Right. So there's a learning opportunity attached to admitting mistakes. And then the third thing about humility is curiosity. You have to embrace curiosity as the path to learning and growing. And that takes a very humble leadership who isn't beating their chest and going, I have all the answers. And you're sitting up there in the ivory tower, right? And not listening to the voices of those that may actually know more than you do, because they're on the ground level, right? And they see the action. They're interfacing with customers. So there's an immense amount of knowledge that can be transferred from the bottom up if you are willing to just be curious and ask your workforce questions. So everyone is learning and growing together. Okay, so that's the humility part. The advocacy part, leadership advocates for others, is that you have, as a leader, you have to believe in your people, right? That they are smart and capable, and so you are extending that kind of trust. I'm kind of giving you a preview of the next one. Leadership is trustworthy, but you have to believe in people that they are capable, right? And being an advocate, this speaks to righting the wrongs. So if there is some kind of unfair practices at work, for example, we still have a gender inequality or inequities in respects to how women are paid compared to their male counterparts, right? If they have the same skill set, et cetera. This is the world we unfortunately live in, right? Mm-hmm. But for leaders that advocate for others, they right the wrongs. They look at where's the disparities and look at ways to fix that, fix the unfair practices going on at work, if there's gender inequality, and if there is even things like, sexual harassment that may go on and people aren't speaking up about it because they're afraid. Well, a leader steps in and says, this is not going to be tolerated, right? So they look into things like that to make sure that the workplace is safe. When you advocate for people, you protect their mental health and well-being, because you want to lessen stress. You want to lessen fear and anxiety, because all those things is what keeps people from running on all cylinders to contributing at their highest and really flourishing on the job. So the advocacy is huge in leadership, and we are not doing enough in respects to advocacy and bringing that as a leadership value and strength. Finally, leadership is trustworthy. Right? That speaks to the trustworthiness part. And a big one that I found is that you trust others. So first, before them earning your trust. Stephen Covey, M.R. Covey, wrote the book on this, that in high-performing organizations, leaders are willing to give trust to their followers first, and they give it as a gift before it's earned. So that's a huge thing. To elevate them, to engage them right off the bat. One of the things that I also touch on the trustworthiness is that you assume positive intent. People are going to make mistakes, but radical love assumes that people have good intentions behind their actions or words, even if sometimes they may seem questionable. So you give them the benefit of the doubt and don't immediately assume the worst about people, because I think this is more opinion than scientific. I think that most people in the workplace are good people and they have good intentions. But sometimes we don't give them that chance, or even the second chance if they blow it, to assume positive intent. So when you have this mindset, it is amazing what it does to improve communication and develop better relationships, to build trust, because that's what we're after. At the end of the day, as leaders, we want to build trust. So we do that by assuming positive intent to really understand our team members better. If you're going to be a trustworthy leader, you have to lead selflessly. You have to apply the servant leadership approach. You have to give credit to others, and you have to be forgiving, right? Again, people make mistakes, and we give them second chances. And the last thing I touch on is the vulnerability piece. If you're going to be trustworthy, you speak your truth, right? So you allow others to speak up. You allow for input to come from various groups. If you're going to speak your truth, you're modeling transparency, you're modeling vulnerability. And everything that I just mentioned, transparency, vulnerability, being emotionally honest, these things are about trust. It's the backbone of successful leadership. And so we have to learn to be comfortable being open with one another about our failures, our weaknesses, our fears. You model the way forward for people to do the same. And that's why Brené Brown, it talks about vulnerability. You have to have courage to be vulnerable. So it's not a soft, fuzzy thing anymore, because it takes a tremendous amount of courage and fearlessness to really to leverage vulnerability as a strength of all leaders.
It's interesting to draw a through line of alignment. All these 5 things that your framework, your core principles, are really things that leaders can embody to make sure that, like we say often, everybody wants to know that who they are and what they do matters. And each of these core principles are things that leaders can embody to make sure that happens. When you're patient with somebody, when you listen to them, when you're kind to them, when you're empathetic to them, when you show a level of humility, when you advocate for them or go to bat for them, and when you give them trust, you're showing them that they matter.
Right.
That's something that's one of the core issues when it comes to the workplace, because people so often aren't treated like they matter or feel like they matter because they're just part of the cog. They're just one of the cogs of the wheel, spinning around. And these principles that you're articulating here in the book are ways that things that leaders can look at and actively embody, actively imitate to make sure people feel like they matter. That's that through line of alignment.
Absolutely. That you matter, that I see you, that I hear you, and that you have a voice here. And all those things, like you said, it seems like common sense, doesn't it?
You think?
You think. It seems. I mean, my book is not. There's nothing in my book that I would say is earth-shattering new information. These are principles that have transcended generations. But now that we're bringing that to a business setting, maybe that's the new part. But it's been a long time coming. I mean, if you talk about, let's say servant leadership, right? When Greenleaf, sort of the founder of the movement, was doing the research, he was going back all the way to his days at AT&T in the 1950s and 60s, and then he came out with his first little book, but those things that a lot of the things that I mentioned in my book, you can trace it back to Greenleaf's original writings and research. He had different language back then, of course, and there was less data available in the 60s and 70s. But now it's way too evident to ignore. Mm-hmm. The only way, and I always call these managers to task when they come to me wanting solutions for their problems. If they are not open to a humane approach to building up their leaders, and if I sense through lots of conversations that they don't buy into it, I don't take them on as a client. I walk away.
It's crazy. And you and I live in this world where we think and talk about these things all the time, and we can say it should be fairly obvious. It should be common sense for people. But the funny thing is that I think that that over the last 40 years or so, maybe 50 years in business, the idea of thinking of people as a function as opposed to a person is so deeply embedded in the mindset that it's a default mode. So in theory, a leader can think, oh, like I should be better, I should treat people better or whatever. But ultimately, when those outside pressures come to bear, whether it's an economic pressure, it's a board pressure, whatever, they can default to that mode where they lose sight of the humanity of other people. And I think that's why, uh, before you and I were on air, we were talking about the pandemic.
Mm.
And, we saw there was the Great Resignation, right? 2021, Great Resignation. People were looking for something better. They were looking for something different, and they had the opportunity to do that. Go down the road a couple of years later, there was the Great Detachment, where people didn't have that autonomy, and now they were just kind of stuck in their job, and then they were just going to disengage. Now we're entering a period where we had record employment for so long in the US, and now we're entering a period where layoffs are starting to tick up, and what's going to happen next. And it's ever cyclical, but I think that's what it is. Like, I think it's when ultimately there's this default mode of not recognizing the humanity in what it is you're doing. And that's why books like yours aren't just things that everybody knows. They're things that have to be brought up.
Yeah, and you forgot the quiet quitting. I think that's the most recent, the buzz term for what's happening with, and I tend to think of I'm playing around with this idea that it's not a new idea, that to have good leaders you have to have good followers, and I'm looking at how we are not setting the example, not only to have good leaders in place to be able to then pass that on to their followers so they can then become leaders, effective leaders themselves, humane leaders, right? We're not setting the example. And so what's happening is you're creating this culture of that lacks accountability, lacks responsibility. They quiet quit. They don't even give notice. They bounce around from job to job to job. And I think that lends to leaders not creating the sort of the atmosphere and helping to develop other leaders within your organization, because you have this younger generation, these Gen Zers coming in now. They're young 20-somethings. They are different animals than say your generation or mine. I'm a Gen Xer. And
me too.
Right. And so, but now I look at, well, how do we deal with this, the intergenerational, we got 4 generations working under the same roof. And under the same roof, in quotations, you might be in a hybrid or a remote setting. But I think that we have to understand how different people have different expectations. And the leadership equation solves that to meet the needs of employees that, say, in their 20s have different expectations. They want purpose, they want growth, they want mentoring opportunities. And so we have to understand that. And I think that once we engage them at that level and not give them a reason to, quote, quiet quit, they will become more loyal and more committed. And as you build up that kind of culture, then you are teaching and modeling the way for them also to go, yeah, this is a great environment to be in. I want to pay it forward. And I hope that if you have responsible young Gen Zers working for you, don't give them a reason to quit or to quiet quit, right? Hang on to them and empower the heck out of them. Be humane, be a humane leader on their behalf.
Yeah.
But you're doing it for a greater purpose, not just to keep that person from quitting, right? You're doing it to create this new generational understanding of, or let's pass the torch down to the next level of leaders. This is how they think, this is how they act, this is what they need, et cetera, right? And I think, to me, that's going to solve the quiet quitters that don't feel engaged. They don't feel like, hey, nobody cares about me, and so I'm going to leave. And I'm not even going to tell them I'm going to leave, right?
Yeah. As we wrap up, one thing I wanted to ask you was, what is your hope for the book? You've spent a lot of time collecting these thoughts. You spent a lot of time doing research. As the book is now out in the world, what is your hope?
Well, I think, my biggest hope, look at the day and age that we are in. And if we look at the examples being thrust upon people about what leadership is, or we're kind of almost reverting back a little bit. If you borrow from politics, I'm not going to get political on the show, but politics has a lot of influence, and media has a lot of influence, and culture has a lot of influence on how we view the world around us, including how we lead others. And so, to me, this book helps to push back against these more power-based ways of leading people that are dehumanizing people rather than lifting them up. And so, to me, more books like mine have to be written, the more we revert back to being a society where people are under these really strong command and control power structures, whether it's through the political sphere or the public workplace sphere, because there's still lots of companies out there that operate like it's still 1950, 1960. Unfortunately, it works for a lot of them. That doesn't mean that they're contributing to flourishing humanity. It just means that it works for them because they're making money. And so they'll continue in this path. But when you look at their turnover trends, et cetera, it's very high, right? And that's why people are quitting. And my example is, I left a toxic work environment for the same reasons, right? It just wasn't lending to my growth as a human being. And so, to me, humane leadership solves part of the problem, to push back against those very kind of a hard styles of leadership that will bring down the hammer on people. And also, the other thing that it solves is it's raising the capacity for any leader, whether you're a CEO or just starting out on your leadership path, to have a template, a baseline for how to lead through humanity, right? And for how to lead through more care and love, and making sure that everybody matters. So I'll end on that note.
Don't forget to grab a copy of Marcel Schwantes' book, Humane Leadership, Lead with Radical Love, Be a Kick-Ass Boss. You can find out more about the book and more of Marcel's writings and podcasts at marcelschwantes.com. And don't forget to find us and connect on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, Threads, and Blue Sky at Barry-Wehmiller. And you'll find more podcast articles and videos at trulyhumanleadership.com. I'm Brent Stewart. Thanks for listening.